extremely excited to introduce today's speaker. I have a personal interest in this topic because I've always been at meetings and events that have told me that, related to animals, that told me that utilitarians care about animals for this reason, rights-based ethicists care about animals for this reason, and Kantians don't really care about animals that much. So I'm very excited to hear maybe a more nuanced take. Professor Christine M. Korsgaard is Arthur Kingsley Porter Professor of Philosophy here at Harvard. She got her BA at the University of Illinois at Urbana and her PhD at Harvard, where she studied with John Rawls. After teaching at Yale, Santa Barbara, and Chicago, she returned to Harvard in 1991. She is the author of The Sources of Normativity, Creating the Kingdom of Ends, The Constitution of Agency, Self-Constitution, and, most relevant to today, Fellow Creatures, Our Obligations to the Other Animals. So with that, please welcome Professor Korsgaard.
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me all right? You can't hear me all right. Is this thing on?
Oh, it's not on.
Okay, can you hear me all right now?
Sorry.
Okay, today I'm going to talk a bit about my book, Fellow Creatures, distinguished, if for nothing else, for having the most beautiful cover in philosophy, the famous Franz Marc's Blue Fox. I'm going to start with a piece of background to the view that I advocate in this book. The 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant, whose views my own are based on, was famous for claiming that we must value every human being as what he called an end in itself. Now, by this he meant that we should treat every human being as having a certain kind of inherent value, from which it follows, by various arguments, of course, that her choices should be respected, that her ends should be promoted, that she has rights that the community should uphold, and that her happiness is valuable and her suffering is a bad thing. It's to say that the things that matter to her should matter to all of us, and that they should matter to all of us because they matter to her. Now, that last bit is important to understanding the Kantian view. Because what it means is to say that we take her and not just the things she cares about to be an end in itself. We mean that her ends matter, at least in part, in fact largely, because they matter to her, and we take her to have a certain value. To put it somewhat differently, we mean that the things that are good for her are good, just plain good, or as I like to say, good absolutely, because they're good for her, and because she has a certain value. Kant contrasted treating a person as an end in itself to treating her as a mere means, which means, speaking roughly, using her for our own purposes in a way that's contrary to her own good and to which she could not possibly consent. Now, some of these ideas have become a part of our general moral culture. When you protest someone's conduct towards you by saying, "You're just using me," you're appealing to a Kantian idea. When we say that people are equal, part of what we mean is that they all have this kind of inherent value and that none of us has more of it than anyone else. Now, whether or not they agree with the details of Kant's moral philosophy, I think many people would accept something like this thought as a characterization of the basis of our moral obligations to other people. But of course, we human beings have not been willing to accord this kind of value to the other animals who share the world with us. Instead, we use them in all kinds of ways. We eat them, we experiment on them, we test medications and other products on them, we keep ourselves warm with their fur and their skin and their feathers. In the past, we've used them for transport and for heavy work, like pulling plows. We've enlisted them in our wars and our police work. employed them to sniff out bombs and drugs and to track the missing, made them fight and race for our amusement, and have found joy and comfort in their companionship. These uses have been, to a large extent, at the expense of the interests of the animals themselves. We've also genetically altered them by selective breeding to suit our own purposes, often in ways that make the animals kind of inherently unhealthy. And we've made them work beyond their capacity and subjected them to torture in laboratory experiments. We've raised them in factory farms where they live short lives in painful and unnatural conditions so that we can fatten them up for the table as quickly and efficiently as possible. Even when we don't use the other animals for our own ends, human beings have often been completely heedless of their welfare, freely killing them whenever they're a nuisance to us and depriving them of the habitat on which they and their communities depend for leading their own lives. Now, I think we need to ask ourselves what, if anything, could possibly justify this difference between the way we treat other human beings, or anyway, the way we think we ought to treat them, and the way we treat the other animals. After all, animals, or at least many of them, are sentient beings capable of suffering and joy with lives and interests of their own. To put the point abstractly, things can be good or bad for animals, just as they can be good or bad for us. As utilitarians like to put it, animals have interests. Now, when we think about what we owe to other people, these are among the facts about them we attend to, their interests and their good. So we should ask ourselves why we might think there is such a vast moral difference between the ways it's permissible to treat people and the ways it's permissible to treat the other animals, if indeed there is. Now, Kant himself argued notoriously that only rational beings are ends in themselves, and that we're therefore free to use the other animals as means to our ends. He thought that we have no moral duties to the other animals, that they are not objects of direct moral consideration at all. Most people, I believe, are uncomfortable with that conclusion, because most people agree that it's morally wrong to subject an animal at least to wanton, or as people say, unnecessary cruelty. Like Thomas Aquinas before him, Kant explained this by arguing that it's wrong to be cruel to animals, not because we owe kind treatment directly to the animals themselves, but because if we are cruel to animals, we're more likely to be cruel to people too. So he thought we have what people have come to call an indirect duty to avoid cruelty to animals. But I think most of us feel like there's more, that's not all there is to it. We should not be kind to animals just to keep our kindness in practice, so to speak, but because we owe it to the animals themselves, not to hurt them if we can avoid it. But although many people acknowledge that we have some duties to animals, most people seem to think that they're very weak duties, since they apparently give way to almost any human interest short of a malicious delight in cruelty itself. People think we should not hurt or kill animals if it is, quote, not necessary, but many people think that if we can benefit in any way from using them, then they count that as making it necessary. Okay, so what's supposed to be the reason for this difference, and is it really a good reason? Now, the philosopher who undertakes to defend the other animals is faced with a kind of odd problem, which is that actually almost no one says. At least the philosophical literature on animals and ethics is almost completely devoted to defending the idea that we have more extensive duties to animals than people usually suppose. The philosophical literature on animals is all on one side of the question. People who think that the way we actually treat animals now is morally permissible almost never write about it or say why exactly they think so. So the defender of animals has almost no philosophically articulated position to argue against. Now, I think that what many people believe, however, at least many just non-philosophical people, just going into the thought, what they believe is that human beings are just more important than the other animals. That's what they think explains the vast moral difference in the ways we're permitted to treat them. So I take that as my starting point in the first part of Fellow Creatures. I begin Fellow Creatures by asking whether human beings are really more important than the other animals. The conclusion I reach is that we're not. This is not so much because the other animals are, as one might put it, just as important as we are, but rather because claims about the relative importance of different creatures or different kinds of creatures do not really make any sense at all. Creatures, by the way, as you might guess from my title, is the word I use when I want to refer to both people and animals, just to avoid that particular problem there. So creatures is the thing that I use when I want to say what we have in common. Now, the point about importance is a conceptual one. Things are important, I believe, only when they're important to someone, to some person or animal. It's true that sometimes one person or animal is more important to another person or animal. You are probably more important to your mother and your dog than other people are, for instance. But that doesn't establish some sort of cosmic hierarchy among creatures, hierarchy of importance among creatures, or different types of creatures. And it's the idea of such a hierarchy that I argue makes no sense. If everything that's important is important because it's important to someone, then there could only be such a cosmic hierarchy if some kind of creature was more important to all of the others than they even are to themselves. Similarly, I believe that things are good or bad only when they're good or bad for someone, for some animal or person. That view is controversial, but I believe there is such a thing as good and bad only because there are creatures in this world for whom things can be good or bad. In the second chapter of the book, I offer a theory of the good based on that basic idea. Now, if it does not make sense to say that people simply are more important than animals, is there some other difference between people and animals that might explain the difference in the ways we think we're allowed to treat them? Many philosophers who write in support of the moral claims of animals believe that in order to make their case, it's necessary to establish that all the differences between human beings and the other animals are matters of degree, that there's no just sort of flat distinction between us and the other animals. They think that once we admit that human beings are different from the other animals in some really distinctive way, people will appeal to that difference in order to argue for human superiority, and with it for the superior moral claims of human beings. Supporters of the claims of animals often appeal to the theory of evolution to argue that we could not be different from the other animals in some way that isn't just a matter of degree. They argue that claims of human uniqueness are therefore unscientific. There is, however, an important difference between saying that all differences between human beings and the other animals are just matters of degree, and saying that all human differences can be explained in terms of the interaction between other attributes that are just matters of degree. Charles Darwin himself, in The Descent of Man, made a claim of human uniqueness. He argued that human beings are the only moral animals. What he meant by that is that we are the only animals who base our decisions on what to do, on thoughts about what we ought to do, on thoughts about ought. He argued that sociability, intelligence, and memory are matters of degree, but when combined and in a high degree, they produce something new, the capacity for thoughts about what we ought to do. I'm not going to go through the explanation of that. My point is just that Darwin at least thought it's not unscientific to believe that human beings may be unique in certain ways, as long as you can explain it in terms of other attributes that we have to a higher degree than other animals. Now, however that may be, I do think that human beings are different from the other animals. So in the third chapter of the book, I ask what exactly the difference is, and whether the difference supports the claim that we human beings are entitled to treat animals in the ways that we do. Unlike many defenders of animals, I argue for the traditional view that human beings are rational and moral animals, and the other animals are not. Now, two qualifications are important here. First, when we say we're rational, when I say we are rational beings, I don't mean merely that we're intelligent and think in an orderly way, but rather that we ask ourselves whether the reasons for which we believe and do things are good reasons or not. We're aware of the grounds of our beliefs and our actions, and we say to ourselves, is that a good reason for believing or doing such and such? I don't believe that the other animals do anything like that. I don't believe they ask evaluative questions about their reasons for action and belief. And second, when I say that human beings are moral beings, I don't mean that we're morally good. I mean that because of the way we choose our actions are subject to moral standards, that they can be either morally good or bad, while the actions of the other animals are not subject to moral standards and cannot be either morally good or bad. It doesn't follow from these differences that human beings are better than the other animals, because you can only judge one creature to be better than another when they're subject to a common evaluative standard and one of them meets it to a higher degree than the other one does. When they're not subject to a common evaluative standard, you can't rate them against each other. What follows from the fact that we're rational and moral and the other animals are not is not then that we're superior to the other animals, but rather that we can have duties to the other animals even though they can have no duties to us. Now, for similar reasons, I argue against the view that what matters to people matters more because our lives are more valuable in the sense of being richer and more interesting than the lives of the other animals. Many people, including some of the more important philosophical defenders of animals like Peter Singer and Jeff McMahon, think that life matters more to people than it does to the other animals because people can enjoy art and music and science and philosophy and a certain deep kind of friendship and so on. I reject that kind of argument. I argue that what counts as a good life for an animal depends on the nature of that animal. It's relative to the nature of that animal. A dog's life is no worse for him because he doesn't enjoy listening to Mozart than yours is for you because you don't enjoy chasing squirrels. Now, there's a different way in which it might matter that we're the only moral animals, if indeed we are. And this brings me back to Kant, and actually to the second part of the book, which concerns Kant's views and what they really imply about the treatment of animals. I mentioned earlier that Kant believed that only rational beings are ends in themselves. That's why he thought the other animals are not the direct objects of moral concern. His view is not, as I'm afraid people commonly suppose, that rationality is an especially valuable property, and we are especially valuable because we have it. It's rather that he believed that the capacity to recognize and respond to reasons, including each other's reasons, places rational beings in relations of reciprocity, which enable us to make certain claims on each other. His argument was something like this. I'm a rational being, when I judge that something is good for me or for one of my loved ones, I treat it as something that's good absolutely. What I mean by that is I decide that I have a good reason to pursue it or realize it, as long as I'm neither harming nor wronging anyone else in doing so. Furthermore, I feel that I demand that others must respect my pursuit of it by not interfering with my actions or attempting to manipulate my choices, and possibly even by helping me to achieve the end if I'm in need of help. That's what I mean by saying I treat the things that I suppose are good for me or for my loved ones as good absolutely. I treat them as things that are worthy of being pursued or realized in anyone's eyes. Things that supply a reason for anyone. By the same token, when I recognize that another person has a good reason for what he does, I recognize that I should not interfere with his choice, and possibly should also help him if he is in need of help. In this way, when we choose to pursue our ends, we make a set of demands on ourselves and on others, a set of laws by which we mutually obligate one another to respect and assistance. The reciprocal demands that rational beings make on each other constitute us as a moral community, pursuing common ends under common moral laws. Kant famously called this the kingdom of ends. Kant thought that animals should not be treated as ends in themselves because they cannot be part of this community. Not being rational beings, they cannot make and respond to moral laws, so they're not ends in themselves. Now, unlike the argument that human beings are privileged or superior simply because rationality is such a valuable property, this is not a dumb argument. Relations of reciprocity are essential to our moral duties to other human beings. Nevertheless, I argue that Kant's story was incomplete. As Kant saw it, when I make a choice, I make a kind of law for myself that I should realize a certain end. I adopt it as a principle that I should realize that end. And I make it a law for others that they should not interfere with me in the pursuit of this end, and possibly even that they should help me to achieve it. But prior to that decision is another. The decision that something should be treated as good absolutely by myself and others simply because it's good for me or someone I care about. This is a prior way in which I claim the standing of an end in itself. Simply because I'm a creature for whom things can be good or bad, I claim that what's good for me should be treated as good absolutely, as something that everyone must respect and pursue. But human beings are certainly not the only creatures for whom things can be good or bad. That's true of all of the animals, or at least of all the sentient ones. Now, if the arguments for human superiority and importance that I mentioned earlier fail, as I think they do, there is no reason why what is good for rational beings should be treated as good absolutely, while what is good for the other animals can be ignored or discounted. Animals are ends in themselves in this sense, too. So there are two senses of being an end in yourself. Being a legislator in the moral community by making and responding to the laws we make for each other is one way of being an end in yourself, shared only by rational beings. Having a good is another, shared by rational beings and the other animals alike. So I argue that Kant was correct in thinking that animals cannot join us in making laws for one another in the kingdom of ends. Our moral relations to people really are different from our moral relations to the other animals. We owe other rational beings certain duties of respect, having to do with choice and freedom, that we don't owe to the other animals. But we have the same reason for treating what's good for an animal as good absolutely as we do for treating our own good that way. That reason is simply that it's somebody's good, the good of a creature for whom things can be good or bad. Rational beings are members of the moral community in the active sense. We create it by making laws for ourselves and each other. Animals are members of the moral community in a passive sense. They fall under the protection of its laws. Now, since many of you are familiar with the utilitarian or consequentialist defense of the moral claims of animals, it's worth thinking a little bit about the similarities and differences between the Kantian position I just sketched and their position. First of all, utilitarians usually believe that either pleasure and the avoidance of pain, or the satisfaction of desire and the avoidance of its frustration, are good in themselves. Any creature who is capable of experiencing those things has an interest either in getting pleasure or in getting his desires satisfied. And all such creatures have what philosophers call moral standing, meaning that what happens to them matters for its own sake. On my view, creatures for whom things can be good or bad have moral standing. They're ends in themselves, as I said earlier, in the sense of having a good. Being an end in itself is the Kantian analog to moral standing, or the Kantian version of it. Now, since I also agree that any creature who can experience pain and pleasure has a good, the two positions identify the same creatures as having standing, sentient animals. Kantian and utilitarianism are the two most influential moral theories of the modern period. So it's worth noticing that if I'm right about this, the two most influential moral theories of the modern period both imply that all sentient beings have moral standing. Where the two theories differ is in how they understand the idea that if you have standing, what happens to you matters for its own sake. Think about that phrase, for its own sake. Utilitarians understand that this way. Pleasure or the satisfaction of desire is good in itself, so it matters, so to speak, wherever it happens, whether it happens in a person or an animal. Animals have standing because good and bad things occur in their lives. The Kantian instead places value in the first instance on the creature herself. People and animals matter, and what happens to them matters because it matters to them. And they have a certain value, a kind of value we accord to ourselves when we choose. The sense in which what happens to you matters for its own sake is that it matters for your sake. In the utilitarian theory, the value of people and animals is inherited from the value of the things that can happen to them. In the Kantian theory, in a way, it goes the other way. The importance of what happens to the creature derives from its importance to the creature itself. Creatures themselves are what have value in the first instance. What happens to you matters because it matters to you. And you matter. And that's true of every sentient animal. This is not merely a technical difference, philosophical difference, but it has practical consequences. Because utilitarians think that pleasure is good in itself, they think it makes sense to add and subtract pleasures across the boundaries between creatures. If the sacrifice of one animal's good led to a greater total good for a number of other animals, it would, according to the utilitarian, be justified. This is why utilitarians are often in favor of medical research on animals, for example. A few animals lead lives of torment, but as a result, many other animals, most of them, as it happens, humans, are saved. But if my pleasures are good only insofar as they're good for me, and yours are good only insofar as they're good for you, we can't just add and subtract them in this way. There's no being who's you plus me, for whom your pleasures plus my pleasures are better. The sacrifice of one creature's life or happiness for the sake of that of others is never that straightforwardly justified. Now, in the third part of the book, I explore the consequences of this position. I'll start with the obvious case, which is eating animals. The wrongness of factory farming I take to be obvious, but I argue that we should not eat animals at all. Some people believe in what they call humane farming, where the animals are treated very well while they live and then slaughtered mercifully. Even in a humane farm, however, the animals must be killed when they are very young. As soon as they've reached a sufficient size and development to be eaten. Dairy animals, similarly, are killed when they can no longer be productive, which is long before their natural term of life. So the idea that humane farming is morally acceptable depends on another quite controversial thesis, the idea that death is not a bad thing for a non-human animal. Now, some people believe that. They believe that all that matters to animals is that they're happy and comfortable while they're alive, but not how long they live or whether at any moment they continue to live. I don't think that's true. There are certainly some plausible reasons to believe that death is often a worse thing for a human being than for another sort of animal. Human beings have plans and hopes and ambitions for the future in a way that, so far as we can tell, the other animals generally don't. Death disrupts these plans and hopes and dreams. But most philosophers believe that the main thing that's bad about death is that it's loss. It's the loss of whatever good you would have experienced if you had continued to live. That general argument holds for animals just as much as it does for people. If death is bad for animals, then we shouldn't eat them, given that it's perfectly possible to have an adequate diet without doing so. Now, I think perhaps the hardest thing for many people to accept is the implication that we should not perform experiments on animals for the sake of medical progress. Giving this up is not just a matter of giving up a kind of food we might like. It's a much more serious matter. But I think once we give up the idea that we're free to use animals in ways that are contrary to their good, there is no way around it. After all, the best way to make medical progress in order to improve human lives and cure human diseases would be to do experiments on people. But we don't do that because we know that it's wrong, and no one thinks that's an unacceptable sacrifice. I think it helps here if we learn to avoid a certain kind of overheated rhetoric. And by that I mean the claim that by experimenting on animals, you often hear people say this, we can save human lives. It's a good idea to remember that there's an important sense in which we can't actually do that. Namely, that everyone dies anyway. What we can do is extend human lives. And that's not a small thing by any means, because I think life is a great good. In fact, it actually follows from my theory in chapter 2 that life is a great good. But it still helps if people ask themselves whether it's really worth inflicting so much suffering on animals in order to extend human lives, rather than whether it's worth it in order to save them. I also argue that we should not use animal products or make animals work if the only way to do that is harmful or fatal to the animals themselves, which in many cases, of course, it is. Now, there's one somewhat different case that I think is interesting to think about. We do ask some human beings, in particular the police and the military, to risk their own harm or death for the sake of opposing and defeating certain evils. These are also both fields in which animals, nowadays in particular dogs, are extensively employed. In the past, it was mostly horses and camels that were used in military in particular, but also for police work. In the military nowadays, dolphins and sea lions are also often used in naval operations because of their ability to detect underwater objects with sonar. If we have the right to ask people to take risks in order to fight crime or the enemies of the state, do we have the right to ask the other animals to do so as well? That's a question that I think doesn't get enough discussion, and it's one that I talk about in the book. I think it depends on whether the animals, like people, benefit from living in the state and are adequately defended by its laws, something which at the present is certainly not the case. It's also worth noting that this case raises very different issues for wild and domestic animals, since the law treats them very differently. Wild animals are for the most part only protected as representatives of their species, not as individuals. And it raises different issues again, for those wild animals who, like the dolphins and the sea lions we're using in our Navy now, live in the open seas or who migrate across borders and therefore don't live in any particular state. Now, another vexed set of practical questions that I talk about in the book concerns extinction and the preservation of species. As many people have noticed, the concerns of environmental ethics and the concerns of animal ethics often seem to be at odds, since the preservation of species or the environment may require doing things that are harmful to individual animals. The obvious example is when a group of animals is culled to prevent it from populating beyond the carrying capacity of the environment in which it lives. Well, I certainly have no solution to propose to these very heartbreaking problems. I do devote some space in the last part of the book to asking what a species is and why it's something we should care about at all. Well, there's obvious reason to care about biodiversity. We all depend on it. That's not a reason to care about each particular species. Some species matter much more to the health of the ecosystem than others do. I think it's puzzling that so many people care deeply about the survival of endangered species who do not seem to particularly care about individual animals. In fact, concern for species sometimes make people treat individual animals as if they were nothing more than abstract representatives of their species. It's important to remember that each individual animal is a center of subjectivity with a life of his or her own. I argue that it's important to care about communities of animals for the sake of the animals themselves. Animals depend on their communities. This is most obvious in the case of social animals, but every animal depends on some community, for instance, for finding a mate. So all animals depend on communities of their kind. And communities of animals do often coincide with species or subspecies. So it's important to care about something that coincides with the idea of a species or a subspecies. This is a reason for protecting those communities from habitat loss, for example. It's not, however, a reason for keeping members of endangered species in zoos, at least unless there's some hope of reestablishing their communities, and possibly not even then. Keeping members of endangered species in zoos at their own expense is, I think, often a case of treating an animal simply as an abstract representative of its species and not as an individual with a life of its own. Now, in the last part of the book, I try to say something about why it's so hard for people to accept the idea that we have extensive duties to the other animals. I don't think it's just because it's a demanding idea and we would have to sacrifice lots of goods and privileges that we've traditionally claimed. I think there's another reason for it. But first, as background to what I want to say about this, I want to say something about a current debate within the community of the defenders of animals, especially the philosophical ones. The friends of animals often divide themselves into two opposing groups, animal welfareists and so-called animal rights theorists. Animal welfareists are focused on the elimination of cruelty in our dealings with animals, while animal rights theorists emphasize the idea that it's wrong to use animals as means to our ends. For this audience in particular, I mean for people at the law school, I want to say something first about this terminology. The word right is sometimes used to refer to a certain kind of moral claim. For those of you who've studied some moral philosophy, the kind of claim associated with what philosophers call a perfect duty. A right in this sense is a moral claim that's either absolute or can only be overridden by another right. It cannot be overridden merely because it does a lot of good to override it. The word right is also used slightly differently to refer to the kind of moral claim that either is or should be coercively enforced by the civil laws. These two uses can come apart. The animal rights position in the philosophical literature mostly uses rights in the first sense to refer to an especially strict kind of moral duty, although many animal rights theorists do also champion legal rights for animals. I don't discuss the question of legal rights for animals in Fellow Creatures, by the way. I do discuss it elsewhere in a paper called, this is a mouthful, The Claims of Animals and the Needs of Strangers, Two Cases of Imperfect Right, which you can find on the web. In that paper, I work out a Kantian case for animal rights in the natural rights tradition. In the book, I stay mostly with the moral question. Okay, but now let me return to the two positions in the philosophical literature, the animal welfarist and the animal rights position. One important difference between animal welfarists and animal rights theorists is this. Animal welfarists often advocate interventions in nature to protect wild animals. For example, using contraception to keep populations at reasonable levels so we don't have to face the question of culling them. The most extreme example of this is the view, which has been advocated by Jeff McMahon and others, that if we could find a way to do it without harming individuals or upsetting the balance of nature, we would be obligated to eliminate predator species altogether, since predation is so cruel. If we phased out the predators, perhaps through contraception, we would of course have to find a different way of controlling the populations of prey animals. Maybe that would be through contraception too. Such extensive interventions in the lives of wild animals would, in a way, turn them into domestic animals. Animals whose breeding and welfare depends upon human beings. That's one of the definitions of a domestic animal. Many animal rights theorists, on the other hand, oppose all human interaction with animals on the grounds that we can only be using them for our own ends. We certainly can't get their consent. They think this is true even of keeping pets, a practice which they believe should be phased out. We must, of course, take care of the animals who've been bred to be pets already, but we should stop breeding animals for this purpose now, so that the practice of keeping pets will eventually be eliminated, so they believe. So they think that all animals should be wild. So we have one group of animal defenders who in effect advocate making all animals domestic so that we can take care of them, and another who advocates making them all wild. Now, what I find striking about this debate is that both sides are driven to advocate what amounts to a sweeping change in the relation between human beings and nature itself. If the welfarists have their way, all animals will in effect be domestic animals, actively cared for by human beings. And if the rights theorists have their way, all animals will be wild animals, whom we may only admire at a distance, taking no responsibility for the cruel aspects of their lives, such as predation and injury, and as far as possible, not interacting with them at all. The welfarists have us taking over the management of nature for the sake of the animals, while the animal rights theorists have us keeping the natural world at arm's length. Now, I think it's no accident that people who think about how we should treat the other animals are driven to these kinds of extremes. I think that people find the idea that we have duties to animals unsettling because given what human beings are and the way we live, and given what the other animals are and the way they live, it's not in fact possible for us always to treat them rightly. We can't control the violence and cruelty of our nature, but given our moral standards, we can't ignore it either. Our relations with animals, in other words, bring it home to us that the natural world is in many ways inimical to moral standards. Rather than face this rather terrifying fact, people pretend that we have no moral duties to animals at all, or only very weak ones. Learning to relate rightly with the other animals with whom we share the planet is not just a matter of being willing to make this or that sacrifice of our interests where they're at odds with the good of animals. It's a matter of coming to terms with our relationship to a natural world that is, at one and the same time, both our home and a place governed by standards that are utterly alien to the moral standards that are so important to human beings. I think we need to face that fact squarely and do as much as we can to treat those animals with whom we do interact in accordance with our moral standards. Animals are beings who share a fate with us. They are conscious creatures, and they are creatures for whom things can be good or bad. That makes them our fellow creatures, and we should treat them as such. Thank you.
I'm sure there are about 1 million questions for Professor Korsgaard, so please wait for the mic to come around.
Thank you very much for that talk. I have a question about the point you made about not being able to add and subtract good or pleasure between different beings. Because it does seem like there are situations where we want to count like the good of a greater number of people more than the good of fewer people. If there's 2 buildings, one is 1 person, and one is 100 people, and I can only save 1 building. So does Kantian ethics give any kind of guidance in that kind of situation? Like how could you do that without adding and subtracting?
There's a whole philosophical literature on how deontological ethics, including Kantian ethics, can handle those problems without taking on the view that you can just add and subtract goods across the boundaries between people. So there's kind of a vast and growing literature on that problem because deontologists realize that we do have these intuitions in some cases and we have to explain. I'll just give you one example. I'm not prepared here to go through the whole thing. For instance, many people who favor deontological arguments make an argument like this. Suppose you were deciding in advance of some situation. If you're familiar with Rawls, say, if you were deciding behind the veil of ignorance, what principles you would want people to act on in an emergency. And the emergency is one where if you do one thing, you can save 5 people, and if you do another thing, you can save 1,000. Well, then the argument is, we would all want them to do the thing that saves 1,000, because acting on that principle would give each of us the highest chance of surviving. So it's not because we add up all those goods. It's because in a distinctive way it's better for each person if we act on that principle. So things like that are the kinds of things this literature generates to try to explain those cases. But I also strongly recommend a paper by John Torek, written 20, 30 years ago now, called Should the Numbers Count? Which makes a powerful philosophical argument that we really shouldn't be worried about it, that the numbers should not count.
Other questions for Professor Korsgaard? I actually have one, if I may. My question is, I just want to understand better your claim that animals don't think in a rational or moral way, as sort of the term of art that you laid out. That seems like an empirical claim, and one that could exist on a spectrum. One could think more or less rationally, one more or less morally. So what evidence would you need to say that animals do or do not think more or less rationally or morally? For example, there's documented evidence of animals, say, sharing food even though they would probably be better off or enjoy more if they ate all the food that's in front of them, but maybe they save some for a friend or some such thing. That seems like it may imply some sort of ought-style thinking, as you put it, and just how that factors into this kind of thesis you have.
Okay, it's certainly an empirical claim. In a way, the question here is a matter of balancing the plausibility of different kinds of explanations for what goes on in general. I think there is a fact that cries out for explanation, which is that human beings really do live very differently from any other animal. And to pretend that that's just not true doesn't seem to me to be empirically respectable. So if human beings live quite differently than every other animal, then there must be something that explains that. And I suppose you could try to explain it simply by appealing to our superior intelligence, but I don't think that really does the job. As I say, it's a question of balancing different explanations of what goes on. And then there are also, for instance, rival explanations for the fact you cited, such as evolutionary explanations of how altruism can be helpful to animals, can be helpful to the survival of certain genes and therefore is practiced by animals with respect to others who practice their genes. Or you could explain it in terms of empathy on the part of the individual animals themselves. So all of these things are up for grabs in terms of scientific standards. And really, I don't have anything special to say about that. It's just a matter of what the best explanation is.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions for Professor Korsgaard? Oh, yeah.
Thanks very much for your talk. Could you talk a little bit about the argument for marginal cases and your response to it that I know you make in the book?
Okay, I do take on the argument for marginal cases in the book. I don't think that it's a particularly good argument for a variety of reasons. First of all, the argument for marginal cases often directed at Kant because it focuses on the claim that what gives a person moral standing is rationality. And then there's a claim that a lot of human beings don't have rationality, by which it's meant sort of that they aren't very rational or well-functioningly rational. So I want to say a couple things about this. First of all, I want to say there are two different notions, two different ways we use words like rational and irrational. One is to refer to a basic capacity, and the other is to refer to how well it's realized. So when I refer to the basic capacity of rationality, I described it here as you're a rational being if you can think about the grounds of your beliefs and actions and evaluatively assess them as good or bad grounds. That makes you, in the descriptive sense, a rational being. You might be a rational being in that sense and not be terribly good at it for a variety of reasons. We sometimes call a person who isn't very terribly good at it irrational. But I think the thing that Kant wanted to focus on is the basic capacity, not how good you are at it, in talking about what made us members of the moral community. So that's part of the point. Part of the point is whether you're a rational being doesn't depend on whether you're in a position to reason well or not. There's a number of subcapacities that go into the capacity to reason, and you can have some of those capacities and not others. At a certain stage of development, when you're growing up, you may be conscious of the grounds of your beliefs and actions in the sense you know that the reason you're tempted to do something is because you want it, for instance, so you understand that about yourself, that you're acting on a desire. But because you're not yet very developed, you're not yet able to evaluate that desire and think whether it forms a good reason or not. So sometimes a person in that kind of state is called irrational, but actually they're just lacking what's part of rationality. And then a third thing, since it's often said in these arguments that infants are irrational, rationality is a property that I think applies to a certain kind of being, not to a life stage. And so to say that infants are irrational is simply a mistake. The capacity of rationality isn't developed in them yet, they're not using them yet, they have the genetic equipment to evaluate them, and it's important when we think about how to treat them that we always treat them as creatures in which the capacity for rationality is being developed. So I think the argument for marginal cases standardly confuses life stages with kinds of beings. It confuses the descriptive fact of having a capacity with how well the capacity is realized. And when you get past those confusions, you can say that human beings, for instance, are in a general way rational beings, that is not disproved by the fact that some people are only 3 months old, or the fact that some people are very old and have Alzheimer's disease. That doesn't show that human beings are not in general rational beings. That doesn't mean, of course, that I think only human beings have moral standing, because I don't, but that's based on a different argument. But I think the argument for marginal cases is generally kind of bad metaphysics.
Are there any other questions, comments, thoughts? Amazing. Let's please thank Professor Korsgaard again.